While the Grand Army of the Republic, with its clone troopers, acclimators, and venators, didn't come into existence till just before the Clone Wars, is it true that the Republic had no military? There's a few ways to answer this question, but to start off we need to talk about the Ruusan Reformations. 1,000 years before Yavin, a series of Sith Wars called the New Sith Wars came to a close after another 1,000 years of fighting. After the end of the war, Chancellor Tarsis Valorum, ancestor of Finis Valorum from Episode 1, changed the political structure of sectors within the Republic, along with demilitarizing the Jedi, putting them under the jurisdiction of the Republic's Judicial Forces, and reorganizing the standing military, which had been led by the Jedi up till this point, into the much smaller Judicial Forces, which were generally a token force of fairly small ships. This was basically what the Republic's military looked like up until the Clone Wars, but while this means the Republic itself didn't have a standing military, it did not mean that in the lead up to the Clone Wars the galaxy was less militarized than they'd actually been before. Instead of being a centralized federal military, planetary and sector defense forces became far more powerful than they ever had been before, leaving behind their former roles as auxiliaries supporting the Republic when necessary. These were not without their limits though. Anything over 600 meters long was restricted in its ability to have a hyperdrive, and was not permitted to hold navigational data outside of local areas. If you think about how big 600 meters was for a lot of the ships that had come before this, it's actually not that much of a limitation. There were some ships like Invincibles that were several kilometers long, but there were also a lot of smaller ships that had been in use up till this point, like Hammerheads and even Sith Interdictors, which wouldn't have crossed this line if you look back to the Mandalorian Wars, for example. This ultimately meant that many of the Republic's former capital ships were sold off to local defense forces, which also built up more of their own forces as well. For poorer sectors, they would buy up excess ships from both the Republic military and from richer shipbuilding worlds like Kuat. Despite the limitations that did exist on large, powerful ships, the hulls themselves remain in production. Large battlecruisers like the Praetor and Mandators were produced in the decades before the Clone Wars as status symbols if nothing else. And though they lacked the armament needed to be super effective compared to what they would be later at first, they were easily retrofitted at the outbreak of the Clone Wars, and had they wanted to oppose the Republic in some way, this retrofit would have been just as easy in other situations as well. When introduced, the 8-kilometer Mandator from Kuat Drive Yards, shown in this video as a fan design by Farshot for Fall of the Republic, our Empire at War mod, was among the largest and most powerful ships the galaxy had ever seen. Kuat alone held 3 for its own defense, while sectors covering Coruscant, Alsakan, Ixtlar, and Humbarine each had 1, all very rich, powerful core sectors. For many other sectors, this meant taking older, purpose-built warships and mothballing them until conflict inevitably arose, getting around the limitations by not having them in active service. A few sectors in dangerous regions of the galaxy were theoretically allowed to maintain larger fleets of larger ships, subject to very hard-to-acquire judicial oversight and approval, but because these tended to be in poorer frontier areas which both had smaller economies and last choice of any sold-off Republic assets, this theoretical right was both hard-won and rarely exercised, as the richer core sectors continued to accrue larger fleets as solely status symbols. These decentralized forces also applied to many corporations and guilds in the galaxy, who over the millennia won or bought rights similar to what many regular systems and sectors had, including direct representation in the Senate. Much like the Grand Army itself, many of these fleets and sector forces were built up in secret in the lead up to the Clone Wars. While the Grand Army of the Republic and some of the larger separatist fleets were built up on largely new hardware over the short-term lead up to the Clone Wars, the forces on both sides of the Clone Wars, Loyalist and Separatist alike, were primarily made up of ships and weaponry built up over longer periods of history, with few occasions for them to be destroyed. Some specific types of ships, like the Invincible class mentioned before, even existed for millennia, and others like the Dreadnought Heavy Cruiser, which became a common sight in the galaxy, saw use for many decades before as well. As major shipwrights needed new status symbols, older hardware would be sold off to the highest bidder, and despite the lack of a centralized Republic Navy or many wartime needs, the galaxy was possibly more militarized than at any other point in history. While we may associate the periods of the Empire and afterwards with faster progress in military tech and more buildup, this was largely on the side of the federal government of the day, where local sector forces were again less common, and few had even survived the ravages of the Clone Wars or Imperial Resistance. There was a lot more new stuff being made, but that's because a lot of the older stuff was being destroyed in a way that it hadn't been in the past. Many other local sector forces were the types of things that would be taken up by rebel groups and used against the Empire, and therefore destroyed. By the time of the Yuuzhan Vong War, a quarter century after the Battle of Yavin, the galaxy had arguably hit a low point in overall militarization. The dangers of the huge buildup of forces with no oversight were clear from the Clone Wars, but the lack of a coordinated central response to the Vong War was also a key failure of the New Republic. So after the end of the Yuuzhan Vong War, many sectors began to clamor for their rights to build up their own local forces yet again. That's all for now. Hope you've enjoyed the video. If so, remember to leave a like or subscribe for more, and if there's another topic you'd like to see me cover on the channel, please leave that in the comments as well. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you next time.